And Hippocrates said, no, 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 we don't appeal to divine or demonic beings. There's something else going on here. It's to do with the flow of humours to the brain. Now, his explanation wasn't quite right, to put it mildly, but what he was doing was substituting for appeal to the gods some feature of the human organism. And this is a mark of the beginning of a scientific attitude. You don't appeal to the gods, you appeal to a natural order which operates independently of the gods. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to join you for this discussion. I'm Greg Dawes. I I began my academic life actually in biblical studies. So within a religious context and studying the Bible, but from a literary and historical point of view. So learning Hebrew and Greek and a little bit of Aramaic, and then looking at the history of the biblical writings. And then out of that came some work on the historical Jesus question, because one of the interesting things about modern biblical studies is that a conflict very quickly emerged between the picture of Jesus which you gain from being part of the Christian faith. You know, Jesus as the Son of God, the unique Savior of the world who died for our sins, and the kind of picture of Jesus that emerges from historical research, where he looks like yet another Jewish apocalyptic prophet, a messianic claimant, very much part of the Jewish world of his time. And so this really interested me. How can it come about that we have two ways of looking at the figure of Jesus, which come up with very different ways of understanding who Jesus was? One historical and the other religious. And this led me in due course into thinking more broadly about conflicts between different modes of thought, different ways of engaging with the world and understanding it. And of course, science and religion, as well as history and religion, are two of the most, are very clearly distinctive ways of engaging with the world, which sometimes come into competition and sometimes into conflict. And so my work on science and religion grew out of that. And that's really what interests me a lot at the moment, although I'm trying to, again, broaden this discussion and thinking about other modes of thought as well. But science and religion has certainly in recent times been the focus of my attention.
Okay. Well, I guess then the first question is just going to build on that. So the first question is, to what extent are... So I'm going to begin by just asking questions relating to the relationship between religion and science, and then after that we'll go into like specific questions about theistic arguments and theistic explanations.
Right.
So starting with the relationship part, to what extent are religion and science compatible?
Right. Well, I've just produced this little book for the Cambridge Elements series, very short book, which a lot of people might have already been able to download free of charge online, as it was available until quite recently. And I begin by saying to ask about the relation of religion and science is a fool's errand, unless we clarify what science we're discussing, whose religion we're speaking about, and what aspect of which we're comparing. So in other words, if you ask, what is the relation of religion and science? The only sensible answer is, well, it depends. Which religion, which science? The reason that this seems to be an intelligible question is that people have focused very narrowly, for the most part, on the relationship between modern science, which is a very particular type of science, and Christianity, which is a very particular type of religion. But of course, if you were to ask, what's the relationship between Buddhism and modern science, you'd get a different answer, or maybe a series of answers. Or if you were to ask, what's the relationship between Christianity and Aristotelian natural philosophy, which preceded modern science, you would get a different answer. Or what's the relation between the religious practices of ancient China and the particular kind of science or the particular kind of cosmology which developed in ancient China, you would get a different set of answers again. So I think there is no general answer to the question, what is the relation between religion and science? And the only reason we think there is that we've been terribly provincial in our view. We've been very narrow in our view about what kind of religion and what kind of science we're asking about. That's not a very helpful answer, is it?
No, that was good. So moving on to the next. Are religious beliefs sometimes conducive to science, or would you say that they're always sort of an obstacle to scientific inquiry?
Right. That's a good question. And again, depends on the kind of religious belief we're talking about. I mean, with regard to the first question, it's certainly true that religions often offer a kind of explanation of why things happen as they do. Things happen as they do. The earthquake occurred because God was punishing us for X, Y, or Z, or the Babylonians captured Jerusalem because the Jewish people, the Hebrews, hadn't been observing the Torah, whatever. So religions do offer explanations of why things occur, and those explanations can sometimes come into competition with the sort of explanations offered by the sciences, or at least they're very different kinds of explanations. A seismologist couldn't make much sense of the idea that the earthquake occurred because God was punishing us for our wickedness. That's just not the sort of explanation a seismologist would offer for why an earthquake occurred. So we've got here competing patterns of explanation. They're not necessarily incompatible. And this, I think, is an important point, because it could be that the earthquake occurred because of two tectonic plates which have been overlapping, and the pressure has built up over time, and suddenly one of them slips and there's an earthquake which occurs. Here's my homespun seismology. But the God was controlling all of this, and he brought this event about in order to punish us. So these two explanations could, at least in principle, both be true. So they're not necessarily in competition, but they're a very different kind of explanation being offered. However, that's not quite the question you were asking, which was about, as I recall, can religious beliefs be a hindrance or a help? I think, again, it depends on... there is a school of thought which thinks that Judaism and Christianity, by making a sharp distinction between God as transcendent being and the world, opened up space for science, opened up space for an investigation of the natural world which didn't make reference to the gods. I think actually that precedes Christianity and occurred outside of Judaism. But in any case, that's a possible account of a religious belief which actually, if God's utterly transcendent and the natural world is distinct from God, then maybe we can investigate the natural world without making immediate reference to God. And that, of course, is what the sciences do. So you could have religious beliefs which actually, if anything, lend support to scientific inquiry. On the other hand, of course, I think if you have a belief that God has revealed certain truths to us in a set of sacred scriptures, the Bible, the Quran, whatever, if you've got this belief that God has revealed certain truths to us by way of sacred scripture, independently of human reason, he's given us this divine revelation to supplement human reason, then you've got two sources of knowledge which can come into conflict. And of course, this is what occurred most famously in the 17th century with the Galileo affair, where what the Bible said about the the Earth being stationary, apparently in the center of the cosmos, and the sun orbiting the Earth, came into conflict with the new Copernican view where the sun was apparently stationary and the Earth and the other planets orbited the sun. So there you had a clear conflict, and based on a belief in a divine revelation, which offers you an independent source of knowledge about the world, or is believed to do so.
I see. There's like in epistemology, there's the talk of like the context of justification and context of discovery. I guess like religion could have like a part in like the context of discovery part. It could like stimulate creativity or whatnot. That plays a part in like, stipulating. Yeah. So it's not like.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, no, I think actually that's a very interesting idea. I understand some of my colleagues in philosophy of science have become very critical of this distinction between context of discovery and context of justification. But I think it's sometimes useful that, people have often pointed out that scientific discoveries can arise from imaginative insights. There's a famous story of Kekulé, the chemist, discovering the structure of the benzene molecule by kind of falling into a daydream and picturing snakes, each snake, biting the tail of the other snake so that they form a circle. And he suddenly woke up and thought, right, that's it. The structure of the benzene molecule is circular. Then, of course, he had to go ahead and prove it. He had to produce evidence for it. Having a dream isn't enough. But on the other hand, the dream might be the moment in which you achieve an insight. But then, of course, you need to shift to the context of justification and try to prove that this is actually the case.
Right.
And I think I recently, in my work on a course I teach on philosophy of religion, I talk a bit about divination techniques, extraordinarily common across all human societies that we know of, that people employ techniques for discovering the will of the gods or discovering what's going to happen. You might read tarot cards, you might throw stones on the ground and look at the picture that they form, the pattern they form. You might examine the entrails of sacrificed animals. You might look at the flight of birds in the sky. All of these things are thought to be significant, to tell you something about the will of the gods or what's going to happen. Now, on the face of it, we might think, yeah, right, this doesn't seem plausible. But one of the questions I ask was, well, maybe sometimes in the process of engaging in these practices, we can arrive at insights which we might then independently be able to verify or to justify. So, for example, in the course of divination, famously, anthropologists have pointed out that very often when you go to a diviner, the diviner doesn't just throw a pattern of stones on the ground and tell you the answer. The diviner engages in a dialogue with you, which is almost like a kind of psychotherapeutic intervention, engaging in a dialogue with you about what your question is, what you're trying to find out, what the problem is you're trying to solve. And the stones might be a useful tool to arrive at some insight about your life. So even a practice as apparently irrational as that of divination, throwing a pattern of stones on the ground, for example, and trying to read some meaning into the way they fall, might actually conceivably be a useful way of achieving certain insights. But then you need to shift to the context of justification and ask if we really have good reason to believe these insights are true.
All right. So I guess that's like a utility. That could be a utility of religion. But do you think there are other utility of religion, or that there is some utility to religion?
Well, I mean, I've done a little bit of reading. I'm not an authority in this field. In the what's called the cognitive science of religion, people like Pascal Boyer, and a whole lot of others. trying to think of some names now. My mind is momentarily gone blank. But the cognitive science are really quite a thriving field. And these scholars, Justin Barrett is another very well-known figure in this field, Harvey Whitehouse. These scholars are very interested in why are religions so ubiquitous? Why are religions everywhere, religious practices? And even if what they're saying is not true, they seem to be all over the place. There are, religions just seems to be a pervasive feature of human cultures. So why? What functions are religions serving? And so they look, for example, at what social functions religions might serve, or what useful cognitive functions religions might serve. I think you can say that even if religious beliefs are false, as it turns out, even if a particular set of religious beliefs is false, the practice of religion can be useful for various reasons. It can bind a society together. It can help people to cope with uncertainty. I mean, divination practices, I think, are a very useful way of coping with uncertainty. They can, religions can serve. But to understand this, I think we need to shift from a focus on religious practices to a focus on religious beliefs. Oh, sorry, the other way around. Shift from a focus on beliefs to a focus on religious practices. Religious practices might be useful, even if the beliefs which they apparently embody turn out to be false. And I think a shift to looking at religious practices, what do religious people do and why might they do it, is a very useful way of getting to grips with religion philosophically.
I see. That was a good answer. Moving from religion to like philosophy of religion. I think you're like, if I understood you correctly last time we spoke, you were like very critical of the way philosophy of religion has been done, especially the idea of like giving arguments for and against God. How would you phrase your critique of the field of philosophy of religion?
I think there have been two problems. I mean, firstly, there's been some extraordinary philosophy done by philosophers of religion. So I just think, I'm greatly in admiration of the skill and insight and acumen of many philosophers of religion, both atheist and theist. They're many of them much cleverer philosophers than I am. So this is not to say philosophy of religion is not high quality philosophy. It often is very impressive. Look at some of the work on ontological arguments done by people like Graham Oppy or others. Very impressive philosophy. The problem is twofold, I think. One is that its focus has been, once again, only one particular kind of religion, namely Christian theism. And often, actually, even worse than that, it's been sort of evangelical Protestant Christianity, because Catholic Christianity, Roman Catholic Christianity, is often quite different. For example, when it comes to the Euthyphro dilemma, are actions good because the gods will them, or do the gods will them because they're good? Famous philosophical question posed by Plato. Evangelical Protestant Christians are much more inclined to a divine command theory of ethics, which holds that things are good because God wills them. Roman Catholic thinkers have always been much more inclined to, well, no, God commands them because they're good, and we have independent access, epistemic access to knowledge of their goodness by way of philosophical reflection. But that Roman Catholic point of view has tended to be neglected in philosophy of religion. So not only has philosophy of religion focused only on Christianity, it's tended to focus on Protestant Christianity. Heaven help us. There are all these other kinds of religion out there in the world, which philosophers have paid practically no attention to. A colleague of mine, Tiddy Smith, former student, is currently editing a collection of essays on animism, the a set of practices which treat objects such as mountains, trees, rivers, as though they were persons, which speaks to them as persons, which addresses them as persons, which thinks of them as having an inner life like our own. The trees are animate, they're alive in the sense that they have some sort of, well, the mountain is an ancestor. It is something to whom you can relate as a person. This is probably one of the most ancient and widespread forms of religious practice, animism. Have philosophers paid any attention to it? No. But why not? Because it's not like Christianity. Well, sorry, this is not the philosophy of religion. The philosophy of religion has often been the philosophy of Christian apologetics. A group of Christian philosophers put out a set of arguments defending their particular form of religion, and a group of atheist philosophers try to counter those arguments. Okay, that's fine, you can do that if you like, but it's a very, very narrow approach to understanding religion. I think the other problem has been that what often people have failed to do is to grapple with the way in which religious people actually think. Most religious people are not philosophers. Most religious people don't engage in their religious practice because they've seen a really good inference to the best explanation, which has God, the existence of God, as its conclusion. There might be a few who do, but for the most part, most religious people don't think like philosophers. So we need to understand the mode of thought, the particular mode of thought characteristic of religion. And that, I think, is quite different from the mode of thought characteristic of the sciences. And that's why a conflict can occur. So two things. I think traditional philosophy of religion has been very narrowly focused on Christianity, and often Protestant Christianity.
Mhm.
And secondly, it hasn't really tried to grapple with distinctively religious modes of thought.
I see. So it was like a focus on only one dimension of religion.
Yeah. And I mean, actually, the one group of philosophers who have tried to grapple with distinctively religious modes of thought are probably the followers of Wittgenstein, people like D.Z. Phillips. I think they go too far in making the religious mode of thought entirely distinct from, say, a scientific one. But on the other hand, they at least have tried to recognize that there is a different way of engaging with the world here. And I think this, of course, is what Wittgenstein, the later Wittgenstein of the investigations, was pointing out, that that we begin with practices. We begin by engaging with the world in particular ways, and our modes of thought are related to those practices, the famous language games and so on. So I think the Wittgensteinians have recognized the existence of distinctively religious modes of thought, even if perhaps gone too far in making them entirely distinct from other modes of thought. So
No, I see.
That's all a bit abstract, but I hope it.
No, that was very good. So I guess we can talk a little about like natural theology and the types of arguments employed there. You have a book on theism and explanation. So I guess just to explain to like people who might not be too familiar with like the terminology, like what do you take the relationship between theistic explanations and theistic arguments to be? Do you think the latter is just a subset of the former is a subset of the latter?
Which was the former, which was the latter again? Remind me.
Would you just say that theistic explanations are a subset of theistic arguments?
Probably, yes. I think that's probably right, because there are forms of religious argument. If you think of a religious argument as the argument for the existence of God, which I think is a very narrow focus again, but nonetheless, that's clearly a form of religious argument. There are forms of religious which are not explanatory, I think, in the sense in which a scientific explanation is explanatory. So an ontological argument is more of a deductive argument. So if, the existence of the universe is a contingent fact, the universe might not have existed. And if all contingent facts have a cause, and if nothing can be the cause of itself, then the universe must have a cause which is distinct from itself. That's an argument, but it's not really is it an explanation? I don't think it is. It's more of a deductive argument. It's not taking a particular feature of the world. Maybe it's taking the existence of the world and offering an explanation of it. Hard to know, really, but I think certainly not all arguments for the existence of God have the same form as that of a scientific explanation, but some do, such as design arguments. So, yeah, it's a bit tricky. It's, where you draw between metaphysical arguments and scientific arguments and so on. It's always a bit fuzzy, these boundaries. But I would say certainly not all arguments for the existence of God have the same sort of as that of a scientific explanation, but some do.
Right. So talking about those that do have that form of science, usually you get like theists like Swinburne, and others. What they'll do is they'll look at some observation, and they will offer God as an explanation, and they'll say, therefore, this gives us a reason to believe in God. And you sort of say that these types of explanations don't work because they don't meet. They're not even potential explanations because they don't entail the observation, and they also don't meet what you call the optimality condition. So could you explain why is it the case that explanations need to meet the optimality conditions in order for them to be potential explanations, and how would it be a case that they would merely be spurious, a case of spurious unification if they didn't meet that optimality conditions? And maybe you could explain those terms as well for the people who are not familiar.
Yeah, I need to. I mean, there could be forms of. I wouldn't say that no religious explanation is even a potential explanation. I think some religious explanations are. A potential explanation I would understand as one which, if it were true, it would explain the fact to be explained, even if we don't have sufficient reason to believe it's true. I'm not sure that it's the case that you could have a spurious form of explanation. So, for example, if you say, this event occurred. Why did this event occur? This event occurred because God willed it. Hang on, ex hypothesis, as it were, if you take the religious belief in God as a hypothesis, then every event is brought about by God. So this is a kind of vacuous explanation. It's that, well, because God willed it, yes, well, we know that already, kind of ex hypothesis. It doesn't single out this event from any other. It doesn't single out this outcome. Why did the earthquake occur? Because God willed it. Why did the earthquake not occur? Because God willed it. You're not giving, there's no content here. There's no empirical content. So that would be a kind of spurious form of explanation. In fact, of course, most religious explanations tend to have a bit more content. So it's not just, God created the world. It's God created the world beginning on the 22nd of October, 4000 BC, in 6 days, and completed it on the Friday night and then rested on the Saturday. Now, that's a very specific claim, and that gives you something you can grapple with. God created the world in this particular way, or God created the world for this particular reason. At this point, you have something that you can produce evidence for or against. So if you claim, well, not only God created the world, but he did so in 4004 BC, beginning on the 22nd of October, I would say, well, seems to be quite a lot of evidence against that. So here we have a falsifiable religious explanation. So I think that it's certainly not the case that all religious explanations are unfalsifiable. Some are, but some aren't. Some you can actually grapple with in a way which is at least analogous to the way in which you might grapple with the scientific explanation. Yeah, so that's one dimension of the question, at least.
So would it be correct to say that you have this condition, optimality condition, which would include sort of attributing an intention to God, and also working under the assumption that working under some kind of a law-like assumption that he's going to be rational at all times, right? And then and so it's only when they meet that that condition that it becomes falsifiable. You get predictions that you could corroborate, so to speak. And
it's slightly more. Yeah, I think in a way what I call the optimality condition, I should explain that. What I called in that book the optimality condition was that, look, given that God is, by X hypothesis, that God is supposed to be omnipotent and omniscient, it seems reasonable to say that he would choose the best possible way of achieving a particular goal. So a religious explanation which has got any content would have to say something like, God did X for reason Y. He caused the earthquake in order to punish us. He created the world so that, there could be beings enjoying freedom who could relate to him. Whatever it is. God did X for reason Y. Fine. That's a potential explanation, perhaps. But then you need to say, well, okay, given that God is omnipotent and omniscient and morally perfect, then you would expect him to choose the best possible way of bringing about that goal. So a very interesting example of this is evolution by means of natural selection. I think that you can say, well, hang on a moment. If this is the way God brought about, created human beings through a very, very long process of evolution by means of natural selection, this was an extraordinarily inefficient and wasteful way of creating human beings. It looks like a suboptimal way of bringing about human beings. So this looks like an argument against the claim that God used evolution to create human beings, because this is a sort of suboptimality, a suboptimal way. There's a way in which God could have created human beings without so much suffering along the way. He could have just done it by speaking his creative word, by saying, let there be, as he does in the book of Genesis. I think the insights, the instincts of the authors of the first chapter of Genesis were quite right. This is how you would expect God to create a world.
Right.
The idea that God will create human beings by setting up an evolutionary process which entails a great deal of wastefulness and suffering. Why? Why would you do that if you're God?
Right.
So this is what I thought of as an optimality criterion. Now, of course, there are various responses to that.
Right.
I'm not pretending an argument which there's no response to, but it still seems to me to be an important way of countering, if you need to counter certain religious explanations.
Yeah, that seems yeah. So if I understood, just to repeat and then correct me. So the idea is going to be that theism implicator is just going to be a spurious explanation. It has very little to no empirical content. It is only when you tack on an intention and some kind of a rationality principle that you get empirical content. But once you meet the optimality condition, the theory that you're offering becomes vulnerable to these type of suboptimal type of arguments, where the theist now has to take the explanandum as the optimal means to maximizing the intention. But then it seems that the atheist can just say, look, here's a more rational or efficient or effective way of achieving that intention. So this explanation doesn't work. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right. I mean, there are various responses to this. I think actually, and one of the responses to the argument I've just put forward is, of course, the position in a skeptical theism, which says, so I've got a cat here on the skeptical theism, of course, which Peter van Inwagen, for example, has defended. I think he still defends it, I'm not sure. Haven't read van Inwagen for quite a while. But skeptical theism, of course, the view that we cannot tell. We lack the kind of modal knowledge which would enable us to say that there is a better way in which God could have brought about these effects. Now, I've got actually some sympathy for the skeptical theism. I do think that our modal knowledge is probably restricted, as van Inwagen argues, to matters of fairly everyday experience or fairly mundane experience. We know that although the chair is here at the desk, it could have been on the other side of the room. There is a possible world in which the chair was on the other side of the room. So, skeptical theism has something to be said for it. And a skeptical theist would counter my argument, my suboptimality argument, by simply saying, well, how do you know that God could have brought about this effect in a way which entailed, for example, less suffering? I think it's a good response. The problem with skeptical theism is that you then undercut any kind of explanation for the existence of God, which relies on saying, if God exists, then you would expect X or Y, because you've just said, well, we don't know what to expect. We don't know what God could or could not do, what to expect if God exists. And that's why skeptical theism is often coupled with something like Reformed epistemology, which denies that we need arguments of this kind for the existence of God. So skeptical theism, I think, has considerable strengths as a kind of pointing out the limits of human knowledge, but it comes at a cost to the theist, that it can undermine a certain kind of argument for the existence of God as well.
Oh, I see. But it seems like an effective strategy that if you push them to, if they have to appeal to skeptical theism, then it seems that the suboptimal argument is very effective at that. I also think that there's, you can show an entailment from skeptical theism to global skepticism, and that isn't very.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't know. Maybe firstly, I think that if skeptical theism were a defensible position, it will probably undercut my suboptimality argument, because my suboptimality argument assumes that we can say, for any way in which it is said God brought about this effect, we can say there is a better way in which God could have brought it about. And if he exists, we would have expected to see this. Skeptical theists, of course, would deny that we can have this sort of knowledge. Maybe there's an inference from skeptical theism to global skepticism. That would be an argument against skeptical theism, I guess, unless you want to be a global skeptic. I'm not sure. But I think at least you can say about skeptical theism that it has other entailments for the theist, which someone favouring natural theology arguments for the existence of God might be unhappy with. So there are certainly questions, but it's clearly a response to the sort of argument I've offered.
Oh, I see. Yes, I have another question. Well, I guess I have to ask two questions because they're sort of related. But the way I read theism and explanation is that sort of you're offering three arguments against the type of potential explanation that meets the optimality condition, which we just said is taking God as having an intention, and taking the explanandum to be the means of realizing that intention. So you have the suboptimality argument, but you have also another argument, which is that if I understand you correctly, you say something like, if the only explanation in town is the theistic explanation, that's not going to be sufficient for us to accept that as an adequate explanation, because it also needs to be a sufficient explanation. And I take that to be, the way I understood you is you say something like, it needs to be corroboratable. So it can't just be a just so story, sort of like an explanation constructed to just explain the explanandum. Would that be correct?
Yeah, I think that's one of the kind of explanatory virtues you would expect from, one of the things that philosophers of science point out is that, explanation should not be just ad hoc. You can come up with an idea, a just so story, but you want something that's independently testable. You want to be able to say, well, if this is true, then you would also expect to see, something else, which you can then go and look and see, well, is this the way it is? So if, I just can't think of an example off the top of my head, but yeah, something that's independently testable, that doesn't explain merely the fact you're, but can successfully explain other facts as well. So certainly that would be, so a theistic explanation which was simply ad hoc, which had no other testable consequences, which you couldn't check by saying, well, what else would you expect to see if this were the case, would be, I think, certainly would fall short of the standards expect. So, and there are other explanatory, virtues as well, which you might expect a good explanation to have. So yeah, that's right. There are, and the way in which I set up that book, although I now would want to modify its view, but the way in which I set up that book was that, look, if you compare natural explanations, those that appeal to purely natural phenomena or causes, natural causes, with explanations which appeal to a divine agent, the natural ones generally rank much higher on the level of explanatory virtues. They're more informative, they're more ontologically economical, they're more consistent with our background knowledge, and therefore we normally have sort of good reason to prefer a natural explanation to a supernatural one if it comes down to a choice. Of course, it needn't come down to a choice, they could be complementary, but if it came down to a choice, natural explanations have a lot of advantages when it comes to explanatory power and explanatory virtues. They tell us a lot more, they're more consistent with other things we know, they're more economical, ontologically, and so on. Yep.
Right. Yeah, that's what I take to be the third argument. So just because somebody asked a specific question, they ask, in the case, because you talk about like a satisfactory explanation, it's not sufficient that it's the sole explanation. It's only going to be the best explanation by virtue of being the sole explanation if it's a satisfactory explanation. And it's only going to be a satisfactory explanation if it sort of it makes other predictions other than the explanandum, which it was sort of like constructed to explain. So would it be correct that you would answer in the affirmative if somebody asked you, in the case that the only explanation on offer is a just so story, ought we accept it? You would say no, right?
I would think no. I think that's a bit, just those stories are too easy. This is a criticism often made of some forms of evolutionary theories of human behavior, that look, you can tell a story about why a particular practice might have been of advantage to us when we were living in this African savannah, to our ancestors living on the African savannah. It might have been useful for them to have certain cognitive powers. Well, that's true, it might have been, but this is very, you've just made up a story. Why does the elephant have a trunk? Well, here's a story about why the elephant has his trunk. Okay, but it's not really good enough. You want that hypothesis to predict something else, so it can then be tested in turn. And so, I think the fact you can't just say, well, look, the existence of God or the action of God or the will of God wanting to do something is the only explanation we have here. Well, maybe it is, but it doesn't mean it's good enough. We want, that's not enough. You can't just make this the God wins by default. That won't do if you want a good explanation.
Right. Would you say the resurrection argument, like the mere fact argument, is one of those just so stories, like the elephant story just told now?
I hadn't thought about that. I mean, I'm inclined to think there are good natural explanations of belief in the resurrection of Jesus myself. So, but yes, you could, and again, this comes back to the questions about historical explanation and how historical explanation differs from religious explanations, because the historian, as historian, is never going to be content, is never going to think that God raised Jesus from the dead is a good explanation of the stories we have about the empty tomb, about Jesus appearing to his apostles, and so on. And that raises another point, actually, which has been a position I've arrived at more recently, that scientific explanations or historical explanations, which I think of as broadly scientific explanations have a particular feature in that they are naturalistic. They only appeal to actually what Christians used to call, some still do, secondary causes. A very famous distinction which emerged from medieval philosophy was between God as the primary cause of the world and the natural order, which was made up of a set of secondary causes. Of course, ultimately the world is dependent upon God. God maintains it in existence, brought it into existence, and maintains it in existence, and determined its overall shape and functioning. But nonetheless, people like Thomas Aquinas believed that there were causal powers in the world which operated in a quasi-autonomous fashion, that things had their own causal powers. This is a broadly Aristotelian view. Natural things have their own causal powers. Yes, of course, ultimately those causal powers only exist because they're sustained by God, but nonetheless, there are real causal powers in the world which operate in a way which is quasi-autonomous of God. Now, if you hold to this view, then of course you've got room for science to operate. This comes us back to the first question, really. You've got room for an investigation of the natural world and its causal powers, which doesn't make reference to God. You're just looking at the natural causal powers of the created order. And that, I think, is what science has always done. In fact, it predates Christianity. I think beginning of the scientific attitude, and people like Hippocrates, the founder of medicine, or even the pre-Socratics, certainly Aristotle, you have this idea of a natural order which operates independently of the gods. The gods might exist, who knows? But in any case, you've got a natural order which operates independently of the gods and which you can investigate. And that is what the sciences have always done. So that's why the historian is never going to accept, God raised Jesus from the dead as an explanation of reports of the empty tomb and the visionary experiences of the apostles, because that's not a natural explanation. Now, it might be that we have no adequate natural explanation. That's possible. I think we probably do, but it might be that we have no adequate natural explanation. But 2 points then need to be made. A, the theistic explanation doesn't win by default for the reasons we've just talked about. And B, I think if you're doing history, at this point you just have to say, well, we have no explanation of the kind that the scientist or historian can recognize as historical or scientific. Such explanations must focus on the created order, the natural order, and bringing in God as a sort of deus ex machina just violates the spirit of science or historical explanation. From the very beginning of scientific inquiry, that's been considered you can't do this. You can't just bring in God from outside the natural order to explain things. This is a point Thomas Nagel makes in his book on Mind and Cosmos, whatever you make of it. Thomas Nagel makes this point that the problem with a theistic explanation is that it brings in God, one that sort of invokes a miracle, for example, like the resurrection, is that it brings in God as, of course, sort of deus ex machina, the figure who emerges from the heavens into the scene to sort everything out at the end. And that's not the kind of explanation that a scientist or a historian would look for.
Right. That seems about accurate, because I also think another reason for that is if we only have a sort of just so story, that is the sole explanation. That's even if we grant that that's like a reason, it has some motivation in that it's the sole explanation. We're just going to have more reason to be committed to like methodological naturalism and other things. So like it's not going to override those other commitments we have. I think would be like another way of putting that same point, right?
Yeah, possibly. But the other thing is, I think, and actually, loath though I am to agree with Plantinga on any matter, this is a point that Plantinga makes, the point I'm about to make, that actually it's very implausible to think that people arrived at belief in the resurrection of Jesus by thinking, what's the best available explanation of the experiences? Just come on, give us a break. What was going on here, I think, was much more that, I mean, I don't know. This is just a possible historical explanation. Some of the followers of Jesus had visionary experiences. Visionary experiences are very common in the history of religions. People have visionary experiences. I won't call them hallucinations because that begs the question, but people have visionary experiences. Religions often begin with visionary experiences. The Prophet Muhammad had a visionary experience on the mountain near Mecca, in which the angel Gabriel appears to him and recites to him the first parts of the Quran to be revealed. The Baha'u'llah, the founder of the Baha'i faith, has a visionary experience in prison in Tehran. St. Paul has a visionary experience in which he encounters the risen Jesus, he believes. So people have visionary experiences. However you explain them, people have visionary experiences in religions. Very common. Now, what happens, I think, here is that the apostles, some of the apostles have visionary experiences, and they interpret them by reference to a whole series of stories found in, well, not necessarily the Hebrew Bible, but more recent Jewish writings, post-biblical but pre-Jesus. The writings of the apocalyptic literature, which talk about a general resurrection of the dead at the end of time. So what happens is the apostles have these vision experiences and they interpret them in the light of these stories they already have about what God is going to do at the end of time. And they understand that, Jesus has been raised from the dead just as these stories predicted would happen at the end of time. Just that Jesus was the first. He was the first fruits, as St. Paul said, of those who were to be raised from the dead. But this, of course, is why the early Christians believed that the world was coming to an end next Tuesday, something akin to it, was that they thought, right, this shows if God has raised Jesus from the dead, then we're living in the end time. It's all about to happen. And then, of course, it was a puzzle because it didn't happen. But, this makes perfect sense historically of belief, the origin of resurrection belief, I think. Now, is this an entirely adequate explanation? I don't know. But they weren't thinking like philosophers or scientists or even historians when they arrived at belief in the resurrection of Jesus.
I see. So to summarize what was said, it seems it's going to be something like a theist can't just offer, God caused it or God did it. They're going to need to meet this optimality condition. Once they meet that conditions, they're going to be vulnerable to suboptimal arguments. But it's also going to be hard for them to give anything more than just so story, to give an explanation that has a novel predictions. But even if they meet that condition, then they're still going to lose to a naturalistic alternative on the grounds of coherence with background knowledge, past success, simplicity, ontological economy, and informativeness. Would that be like an accurate summary of your case?
I think it would. It's probably put a bit more strongly than I would put it. I mean, the book was more trying to explore under what conditions would a theistic explanation look satisfactory, just in the general explanation in general. Although I think I would now want to say that, look, insofar as theistic explanations appeal to an agent that's not a natural agent, they're not the kind of explanation that a scientist or a historian would look for. And this isn't because scientists and historians are working under sort of atheistic assumptions. It's because from the very beginning, and I say from actually from the time of the pre-Socratics even, the founders of ancient Greek philosophy and Aristotelian natural philosophy, or the sort of, take Hippocrates. Hippocrates, the founder of modern medicine back in the 4th century BC, of modern medicine, the founder of medicine, often thought of as a founder of medicine. Hippocrates wrote a famous treatise on epilepsy, or what he called the sacred disease. Now, he called it the sacred disease because this is how it was known. It was often attributed to possession by some divine or demonic being. And Hippocrates said, no. We don't appeal to divine or demonic beings. There's something else going on here. It's to do with the flow of humors to the brain, the flow of certain fluids to the brain. Now, his explanation wasn't quite right, to put it mildly, but what he was doing was substituting appeal to the gods, substituting for appeal to the gods some feature of the human organism. And this is a mark of the beginning of a scientific attitude. You don't appeal to the gods, you appeal to a natural order which operates independently of the gods. So I just think that now that this sort of naturalistic attitude, characteristic of the sciences and history, just means that talk about God doing things just doesn't fit. It's just not the kind of explanation that a scientist or a historian would look for. Now, if you want to do metaphysics, you might want to say these arguments still have some force, but certainly they're not. I think the naturalism of the science is very, very deeply rooted historically and quite intrinsic to what science is. Talk about God just doesn't fit into science.
Yes, I would agree with that. Just one more thing on these explanation before we move to some other topic. What I want to ask you, like a concrete example, but you talk about singular and general explanations as well. And then you say some explanations explain event types, whereas others explain event tokens. And the type of explanation it seems like the theist is mostly going to offer is going to be the singular type of explanation. But if somebody holds to like a Humean view of causation, there wouldn't be any room for these types of singular explanations, which are going to account for most explanations coming out of the theist. Is that correct?
Yes. Well, if you hold to a Humean view of causation, it's certainly the case that all explanations must be of event types, and they must fall under a general law. Most religious explanations don't, but this, I think, is because of their characteristic form. I wrote a wee piece years ago, which I still think on what I call them paradigmatic explanations, although the word paradigm has so many uses, I don't know if that's a very happy word to use. But look, I think there is a pattern of religious explanation, which I mentioned before in connection with the resurrection of Jesus, which is very characteristic of religious practices, of religious communities and contexts. And this is, look, we have a story, we have an authoritative story. It might be the story of God liberating the Hebrew slaves from Egypt, or it might be the story of Muhammad's hijrah, Muhammad's migration from Mecca to Medina in the year 622, or it might be the story of the mythic ancestors who walked across the landscape and created the landscape as we know it, as in the case of perhaps Australian Aboriginal stories of the dreaming. We have these mythic tales about origins. The story of the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus is a mythic story of death and rebirth. A myth, by the way, might be true, or might have elements of truth in it. I mean, that Jesus was crucified, pretty confident was true. But in any case, a mythic story is a story of origins, and a typical religious explanation takes the pattern of the myth and applies it to some contemporary event in order to understand it or to interpret it. So, for example, Martin Luther King, the great African American civil rights leader, once gave a speech in which he said, I've stood upon the mountain and I've seen the promised land. What he was doing there was, of course, appealing to the story of Moses, bringing the Hebrews out of captivity and into the land of Canaan. Moses, of course, was told he wouldn't be allowed to enter the land. He would die before then. Now, what Martin Luther King was doing was taking this biblical story and imposing it upon, applying it to the situation of African Americans in the United States in the 1960s. So we had a very powerful use of a biblical story to understand, to explain, to interpret a series of contemporary events. That, I think, is the characteristic pattern of religious explanation. Or take the case before, when if some religious believer says the earthquake occurred because God was punishing us for our sins, what the believer is doing there is not saying what's the most plausible explanation of the earthquake's occurrence. What the believer is doing is taking a mythic story, probably actually the one of the Babylonian destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC, which we find in the Hebrew Bible, where God sends the Babylonians to punish the Hebrews, the Judeans, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, for disobedience to the Torah. So the catastrophe is a punishment from God. That's the story, the original story. It's an event which occurred in 586 BC, which is understood as an event of punishment, and it's in the Hebrew Bible. When believers today say, as some do, earthquake occurred in order to punish us for X, Y, or Z, They're not saying what's the most plausible explanation of the earthquake. They're taking a story which forms part of their tradition, part of their sacred scripture, a mythic story, and they're applying it to they're understanding the contemporary event in the light of it. They're taking the pattern of the myth and applying the pattern of the myth to the present. And of course, myths are very flexible in this respect. There are very many different ways in which you can apply a myth to the present. So religious explanations are notoriously flexible. But nonetheless, I think that's what's going on here. So, inference to the best explanation, etc., all fine, but it bears very little relation to the way in which religious people actually think, which is more by employing what I've called this mythic mode of thought. You take a story about a past divine action and you understand what's happening now as a re-embodiment of the pattern of the divine action that occurred in the past.
Yeah, I see. So it's almost as if sort of like the people who try to give these scientific explanations utilizing God are regressing to a time even prior than the pre-Socratics.
I think if not necessarily, if you're pretending to do science, if you're offering what Alvin Plantinga calls Augustinian science, if you're thinking there can be a science which invokes God as an explanation of particular events, then you are actually going back to a time, to an attitude which predates the emergence of science. And I think it's simply not scientific at all. I think Augustinian science, if that's what it is, would be a contradiction in terms. Of course, you can take the attitude that the secondary order, the natural order, the order of secondary causes, is one created and sustained by God. So if someone like Richard Swinburne wants to say, look, I'm happy to accept natural explanations, but there are facts about the world which science can't explain, and a theistic explanation can offer a satisfactory explanation of those facts. That's a different attitude again. So Swinburne is not offering an explanation which competes with scientific explanations. He's offering what he thinks of as a complementary explanation which can stand alongside the scientific ones. So I would distinguish those two types of theistic explanations, ones which compete with natural explanations and ones which say, look, here is a fact that science perhaps can never explain. If there are only such facts, I don't know, but Swinburne thinks there are. The second is, at least in principle, a defensible way of operating.
I see. Yeah, so I think I have two more questions and then we're gonna be reaching an hour and a half. So I think we can like summarize and end the AMA, as we've been going over an hour. So the question I have is, if a black box generates propositions and so far of the propositions it's generated, 99% are true, ought we assume the next proposition it generates is more likely true than false, regardless of the content of that proposition?
I don't know. If you think, as many people do, if you take an externalist view of knowledge, which is a kind of reliabilist view, there are two ways of thinking about the kind of third condition for knowledge. If you think of knowledge as true belief plus something else, the traditional view was that knowledge was true belief plus evidence or arguments which gave us reason to believe. to think the belief was true. So justification. Of course, some approaches to epistemology these days take a more what's called externalist view, which thinks that the third condition is something like reliability of the mechanism giving rise to the belief. Then a true belief would be, an instance of knowledge would be a true belief produced by a reliable mechanism. I suppose if you take an externalist, which I think, I'm not sure if it's entirely, if a purely externalist view is going to work. Big debates about this. But if you took a purely externalist to say that, but I don't think I would want to take such a view. Does that make any sense?
Right. No, I agree.
Yeah, I think that question raises the questions about whether you can have a purely externalist epistemology, and I'm not convinced you can, but that's a big and much debated topic.
Right. I think like the black box is sort of supposed to be an analogy for sort of like religious book scriptures, because a lot of times you get like theists, like Muslims or others, saying that their religious books have made all these amazing predictions, like that people at the time couldn't have possibly known about. And since they've been accurate, that's going to give us a reason to believe the other claims that the book makes about the existence of God.
I think actually this gets back to my point about mythic or paradigmatic explanation. I'll probably call them mythic explanations these days, but if anyone's interested, if you search for a paradigmatic, as in paradigm, explanation, and my name, I've got this paper I did years ago on it. I think it's quite interesting. Anyway, I'll probably call them mythic explanations these days in the sense of myth. When people say our scriptures predict X, Y, or Z successfully, what they're often doing is engaging in a process. They take the pattern of divine action in the past and they apply it to some present event, which makes it look like, this explains the present event as well. But the process is often notoriously slippery. They've redescribed the present event so as to make it fit. You see this happening in the Gospels, actually. The Gospels appeal to the fact that the life of Jesus fulfills the Old Testament prophecies. The Old Testament, the Hebrew Bible predicted X, Y, or Z, and look, Jesus did X, Y, or Z. But they've often invented the story of Jesus doing X, Y, or Z, or they've carefully re-described what Jesus did so that it fits the original. So I think often you need to take these claims to scriptures successfully predicted X, Y, or Z with a degree of skepticism. Can you think of an example? Can you give me an example?
Yeah, I can give an example. So for example, with the Muslims, they want to say things like the Quran spoke about like the Big Bang, and we couldn't possibly have known that. It spoke about the embryo and the other parts of development, which people in the 7th century couldn't have known. They usually call them scientific miracles. And I guess other religions as well, like the Hare Krishnas with the Gita or other texts, they'll say something similar. So they'll say, look, these things could have been known by the people in the 7th century, but yet we find them in the scripture. Obviously, it's obviously that's false, right? The scripture, if you go back to authoritative commentary on the scripture, it talks about something completely different. But if we were to grant that this scripture, for the sake of the argument, that this scripture actually got these things correctly, would that give us a reason to trust the other things scriptures say, especially about God's existence?
I think actually what we're back with here is something like the inference to the best explanation argument. here is a saying, here is something found in the Quran. Is there a natural explanation? What are the possible explanations of the Prophet Muhammad, for example, having this kind of knowledge or speaking in this way? One of the possible explanations is he's inspired by God, or that he's speaking God's word more precisely. Well, yes, but maybe there are other explanations. For example, the indigenous people of New Zealand, the Maori people, have a creation account which begins with what they call te kore, the nothingness, te kore. And of course, it's tempting to think, and then the nothingness, out of the nothingness emerges various stages of the world's creation, or not creation exactly. Out of the nothingness emerges the various stages of the world as we know it. It's a wonderful mythic account of the creation of the world, or the emergence of the world from nothing. But would you say this indicates that they were aware of the Big Bang? Well, there's a certain structural correspondence, but the idea of things emerging from nothing just seems a kind of intuitively, if you're going to talk about the origin of things, this just seems a kind of pretty obvious pattern. So I think often people are simply reading far too much into what the scriptures say, or the traditions say, or the myths say.
Right. But what if somebody was making the inductive argument that if we grant that Scripture actually talks about these things, and these things are true, to move from something like this and this and this and this, and these propositions have been true, therefore all the propositions in Scripture are true. Would you say that's like a problematic inductive inference?
Well, I think it's problematic for a couple of reasons. One, okay, even if we granted that initial claim, a reliable mechanism, by definition, has to be one which offers true results more often than not. So it's not enough to say, here are 3 predictions the scriptures made which are true, therefore they're all true. Hang on a minute. That could just be a matter of accident. A reliable mechanism is going to be one in which the outputs it gives are true more often than not, and we have independent reason to know this. We know they're true more often than not. So you have to have a success rate greater than 50% at the very least for it to be a reliable mechanism. So I think often, and I'm not even sure how you would possibly try to, when it came to a set of scriptures, does what the Bible say, has it turned out to be true more often than not? I have no idea how you'd even begin to answer that question. I think it's probably an impossible question to answer. Firstly, because the Bible often didn't make clear predictions. When it did make clear predictions, they were often after the fact. I mean, the book of Daniel apparently makes clear predictions about what happens in history was going to happen in the next 300 or 400 years, but that's only because it was written 300 or 400 years after the time at which it was set. So it was making predictions after the fact. A lot of biblical predictions are predictions after the fact. So I think, I think it's just an impossible question to answer, actually. If you're going to argue your scriptures are a reliable knowledge-producing source, I've no idea how you could convincingly argue for that, if reliable means true more often than not, or successful more often than not. I think it's just a silly argument. It's just awful.
I guess we'll take one question and then we'll do some promotional stuff and then we'll end. So the last question is, what do you think about this demarcation between the natural and the supernatural, or the natural and the non-natural? Should we just get rid of that, or can you make sense of such distinctions?
Yeah, I think it's really difficult, actually. I think this is one of the problems with the position known as naturalism, is what constitutes the natural. Because, if you define the natural reference to the kind of spoken about by our best physics, for example, well, that's fine, but probably in 50 years' time, our best physics will have moved on. So there's that kind of problem associated with identifying natural, what counts as natural. So there are difficulties. But I do think, once again, that the idea that there exists a causal order which operates in a quasi-autonomous fashion, the natural order, if you like, or the order of secondary causes, or the order of created causes. This is a very ancient idea, which is really the idea which gave rise to science and history as we know it. And it goes back, it predates Christianity, so Christians call them secondary causes because they think God's the primary cause. The Hippocratic writers might think of them as the natural order. Aristotle might have thought of it as the natural order in some sense. There is something there which I think that there is a causal order which, even if gods exist, operates independently of the gods. It's a very ancient one, and I think, it's an idea without which you couldn't have science. So there is something there, I think, which has been characteristic of the emergence of a scientific attitude.
Oh, okay. So when you talk about the secondary, are you saying that the natural is going to be related to the causal realm?
Well, yeah, I mean, classicists like Jeffrey Lloyd, a wonderful scholar who, after years studying ancient Greek philosophy, discovered ancient Chinese philosophy and then learned Chinese, and wonderful example of scholarship, so as to be able to compare Greek and Chinese philosophy. Jeffrey Lloyd is one of those writers who writes about the discovery of nature, in inverted commas, word nature, that the idea of the natural order is absolutely critical to the emergence of a scientific attitude. The idea that there is this causal order which we can investigate, and that talk about gods doesn't belong in this kind of investigation. I think this was an absolutely critical event in the emergence of just a precondition for scientific inquiry. And it predates Christianity, but it's compatible with Christianity or Islam or Judaism, because as long as you make some sort of a distinction like that between primary and secondary causes, not all Christian and Muslim thinkers did, but a number did. So then you have does that make any sense?
Yeah, no, that does make sense. Yeah. So I guess to end it off, if somebody wants to read sort of like this new philosophy of religion that goes outside of Christianity and examines other things and doesn't just think in terms of rationality or argumentation, what's some good stuff to read?
There's not a lot out there at the moment. The one person who I can think of off the top of my head who has done a bit of writing about broadening the scope of philosophy of religion, there's more than one, but one person whose work I've been quite impressed by is Kevin Schilbrack, Schilbrack. He's written nicely about the need to broaden the scope of the philosophy of religion. There have been others. There are others as well, but look, I'm just sort of, I probably would find it hard to give you the names, stopping and thinking a bit more. But as I say, a group of us are involved in putting together a series of essays on animism at the moment, which will, I hope, offer an example of this. But Yeah, I think there are actually quite a number of people who, like myself, are dissatisfied with and trying to so actually I've just got another book here by Mikhail Burley called A Radical Pluralist Philosophy of Religion, which again is another example of a philosophy of religion which is pluralist in the sense that it doesn't just think of Christianity as the only possible source of religious insight. So it tries to take the diversity of human religions seriously. Yeah. So there are a number of, but it's a fairly new development. And most philosophers of religion are still beavering away on the same old questions, which is fine. We can't all do everything. But
Right.
Yeah.
So I guess there we've reached the hour and a half. So if somebody wants to like read your work and look more into the stuff we've spoken about, where could they find you and what?
There's I mean, there's a little book just come out from Cambridge University Press, which I think I mentioned on the Facebook page, called Deprovincializing Science and Religion. That's probably that is the most recent. I did do a little book a couple of years ago, the Palgrave Pivot series called Religion, Philosophy and Knowledge. I think some of this is available, some of this is freely available on the web, but that's quite a useful little book. I've put some of this material on the Otago University archive, which is freely available pre-publication. But again, a web search would normally turn it up. So Religion, Philosophy and Knowledge was a book which tries to offer a broader approach to the philosophy of religion. The article on paradigmatic explanation, or mythic explanation as I now call it, which tries to say religious explanations are quite a different form from scientific ones in practice. That's actually available on academia.edu as well. So again, it's fairly available on the web. So if you did a search for paradigmatic explanation in my name, you'd find it. So the stuff, there's a few things, but that's but probably the latest Cambridge element on science and religion, called Deprovincializing Science and Religion, a place to start as actually, I'm quite influenced in that book, the work of Mikael Stenmark, Swedish theologian, actually, interestingly enough. So anyway, but that will be a good book with which to start.
And the animism, that's not out yet, right?
No, that will be out probably next year now, early next year, we hope. But that's a collection of essays by a whole series of philosophers of religion. Look, let's take this really common form of religious practice, which was traditionally called animism, thinking of things like rivers and mountains as having an inner life, as something you can relate to as though they were people. What do we make of this as philosophers? So, that should be out early next year, I hope.
Right. And you also have like a Phil papers page as well, where people can find.
Yeah, the stuff there. I haven't, I confess, uploaded as much as I should have to that, but it's on my list of things to do sometime to update that.
We'll post the links here, so people can get that. Thank you so much for the AMA. Really appreciate it, and I hope you can do something in maybe like a couple of months again.
Sure. I mean, if there are particular matters that people want to follow up, they could always just email me, depending on how busy I am, or I'm happy to try to get back to you with responses or copies of things if people are interested.
Yeah, we'll make sure to put the email. It's the it's the same one from last time, right?
Yes, it'll just be gregory.dawes@otago.ac.nz.
Right. Yeah. I'll make sure to put that. Great. Again, thanks for the AMA. This was lovely.
Thank you.
I'll make sure to link you the YouTube link for this recording.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, thank you. I hope it was interesting and useful.
Oh, definitely.
Okay, good. Thank you.